Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Sienna Vance laughed as she unclasped the heirloom diamonds from Elena's neck in front of the entire charity gala committee. "You really shouldn't be wearing something this heavy, Elena," she said, her voice a melodic trill that didn't quite hide the sharp edge of her contempt. She held the shimmering Vance Star up to the light of the library's crystal chandelier, watching the 3-carat center stone fracture the glow into 1,000 jagged pieces. "It drags you down, makes you look tired, doesn't it, Dad?" Arthur Vance looked up from his crystal tumbler of scotch, his eyes glazing over his eldest daughter as if she were a piece of furniture that had been moved out of place. "Sienna is right. It suits her complexion better. Let her wear it for the evening. She's the face of the foundation, after all." The humiliation was quiet, efficient, and performed with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 30 years being told she was the sun while her sister was merely a shadow. The room, a sprawling library filled with the scent of aged leather and expensive sandalwood, fell into a suffocating silence. Beatrice Vance sat in her velvet wingback chair by the fireplace, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, skeletal beat against the mahogany armrest. Her sharp eyes darted between her granddaughters, but she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin, enigmatic line. She watched as Sienna draped the diamonds over her own neck, the silk of her $5,000 jumpsuit rustling with every self-satisfied movement. Elena felt the ghost of the cold metal against her skin, the sudden lightness around her throat feeling more like a noose than a release. She didn't reach for her neck. She didn't flush with the heat of embarrassment that her sister so clearly craved. Instead, she stood perfectly still, watching the reflection in the gilded mirror above the hearth. "There," Sienna chirped, adjusting the necklace so it sat perfectly against her collarbone. "Now the committee can see what a real Vance looks like. Marcus, get a photo of this for the press release. We need the donors to see the legacy in action." Marcus, the family's long-suffering publicist, raised his camera with a hesitant glance at Elena. He snapped the photo. The flash was a momentary blinding white, a digital punctuation mark on her public demotion. The committee members, a collection of local social climbers who knew exactly which daughter held the keys to the Vance fortune, let out a chorus of performative murmurs. "Stunning, Sienna," one whispered. "A perfect fit," another added, pointedly ignoring the woman who had actually spent the last 6 months organizing the gala. Julian Thorne stood by the window, his jaw tight enough to crack bone. He moved as if to speak, his hand tightening around the leather-bound legal folder he always carried, but Elena caught his eye. A nearly imperceptible shake of her head stopped him. Not yet. The time for legalities hadn't arrived, but the time for evidence was well underway. "I'm sure the committee appreciates the aesthetic upgrade," Elena said, her voice level and devoid of the tremor her sister expected. Sienna turned, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She leaned in, the cloying scent of her white floral perfume, a fragrance that cost more than most people's monthly rent, invading Elena's space. "Don't be bitter, darling. Some people are born to lead the gala, and some are born to check the guest list. Just make sure the catering staff knows their entrance is in the back. You have a knack for dealing with the help." Arthur chuckled, patting his younger daughter's hand. "That's my girl, always thinking of the details." Elena watched them. She watched her father's blind adoration and her sister's predatory triumph. For years, she had been the sleeping lion, the one who fixed the books her sister cooked, who smoothed over the scandals, and who kept the Vance name untarnished while being treated like an interloper in her own home. She felt the small, hard rectangle of her phone inside her silk clutch. The red light of the recording app had been glowing for the last 20 minutes. Every word, every dismissive chuckle from her father, and the clear, verbal admission of the theft of a restricted heirloom was now digital gold. "I'll go check on those catering details now," Elena said softly. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. As she passed the matriarch, Beatrice's hand shot out, surprisingly strong for her age, and gripped her wrist. "The lion doesn't lose sleep over the opinions of sheep," the old woman whispered, her voice a dry rasp that only she could hear. But she does wait for the sheep to wander too far from the flock. Elena squeezed her grandmother's hand once and exited the room. The hallway was cooler, the air stilled by the thick tapestries that lined the stone walls. She pulled her phone from her clutch and hit save. Then, she opened an encrypted messaging app and sent a single line to Julian. The necklace she took is the one from the North Vault, the one with the loose setting and the hidden tracking chip. She leaned against the cool stone wall, her heart beating with a slow, predatory rhythm. Her sister thought she had just stolen a piece of jewelry to flaunt her status. She didn't realize she had just walked into a trap that had been 3 years in the making. Elena looked out the window at the sprawling estate, the manicured lawns stretching out like a kingdom she was no longer allowed to rule. "Enjoy the diamonds, Sienna," she whispered to the empty hall. "They're the most expensive handcuffs you'll ever wear." She began to walk, her pace steady and purposeful. The gala was in 3 days. 3 days until the Vance Star, and the woman wearing it would be scrutinized under a light far harsher than a library chandelier. The countdown to the first fall had begun. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance dining hall, illuminating the dust motes dancing over a spread of untouched smoked salmon and artisanal cheeses. Elena Vance sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her coffee gone cold and bitter. Across from her, Sienna draped herself over an armchair like a cat that had finally caught the canary, her silk robe shimmering with every calculated movement. Arthur Vance didn't even look up from his tablet as Elena entered. He was busy nodding at something his younger daughter was saying, a rare, indulgent smile tugging at his lips. The favoritism in the room was thick enough to choke on, smelling of expensive Arabica and the cloying scent of Sienna's lily-heavy perfume. "You're late, Elena," Arthur said, his voice clipped. He finally glanced at her, his eyes lacking the warmth he had just showered on his favorite. "Sienna was just telling me about her vision for the gala's opening sequence. She has a natural instinct for the brand that you seem to have lost lately." Sienna leaned back, swirling a glass of pomegranate juice as if it were vintage champagne. "It's not her fault, Dad. Not everyone is meant for the spotlight. Some people are better suited for the behind-the-scenes drudgery." She turned her gaze to her sister, her eyes glittering with a malice she didn't bother to hide. "In fact, I've decided to help you out. I've already contacted the caterers and the florist. You looked so stressed yesterday. I figured I'd take the heavy lifting off your plate. You can focus on the guest coats and the parking valet." The insult hung in the air, a deliberate public demotion in front of their father and the 2 silent servers flanking the sideboard. Elena felt the familiar sting of outrage, but she kept her hands steady beneath the table. She reached into her pocket, her thumb brushing the smooth glass of a burner phone. "You're taking over the event coordination?" Elena asked, her voice deceptively level. "I'm saving the event," Sienna corrected, flashing a brilliant, predatory smile. "The Vance Star deserves a presentation that matches its brilliance. Speaking of which, Dad, I think I should be the one to wear it for the keynote. It's a new era for the company, don't you think?" Arthur reached over and patted Sienna's hand. "A marvelous idea, you have the poise for it." He turned a stern look toward his eldest. "Elena, make sure the insurance riders are updated for Sienna's name, and don't make a fuss. This is what's best for the family legacy." Elena took a slow sip of her cold coffee, letting the bitterness ground her. "Of course, Father, if that's what you believe is best." 10 minutes later, Elena stood in the shadows of the wood-paneled library. The heavy scent of old paper and beeswax usually calmed her, but today, her pulse was a drumbeat of anticipation. Julian Thorne was already there, leaning against a bookshelf with a tablet in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression professional yet laced with a fierce loyalty that Arthur had long ago discarded. "Is it live?" Elena whispered. Julian turned the screen toward her. A map of the estate appeared, centered on a pulsing red dot. "The signal is crystal clear. She has it hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry humidor. She hasn't realized the Vance Star she took is actually the 1924 exhibition replica." Elena felt a surge of cold satisfaction. "And the setting? Loose, just as you requested, Julian confirmed, his voice low. The moment she steps under the high-intensity heat of the gala stage lights, the metal will expand just enough. The center stone will drop, and because it's the replica, it won't just fall, it'll shatter. In front of the board, the press, and the International Diamond Consortium. She thinks she's stealing my birthright, Elena said, watching the red dot pulse on the screen. She doesn't realize she's holding a ticking social landmine. The gala is in 48 hours, Julian reminded her. Are you sure about this, Elena? There's no turning back once the press sees the Vance heir flaunting a fake that falls apart on stage. Your father will be ruined along with her. Elena looked toward the door, where she could hear Sienna's high-pitched, entitled laughter echoing from the hallway. Her sister was currently ordering the staff to move Elena's personal belongings out of the primary suite to make room for a glam station. Arthur chose his side 3 years ago when he let her lie to the board about the Zurich accounts, Elena said, her voice turning to ice. He didn't just coddle a wolf, he fed her my life. Now he can watch her teeth sink into his own reputation. She handed Julian a flash drive. This contains the real insurance logs, the ones showing that the genuine Vance Star was moved to a private vault in my name 6 months ago. When the replica shatters, she'll try to claim I swapped it. This will prove I was the only one protecting the asset while she was busy playing dress-up with a fraud. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Sienna sauntered in, already dressed in a $3,000 suit that Elena had paid for on the corporate account. "Oh, Julian, there you are," Sienna said, ignoring Elena entirely. "I need you to draft a non-disclosure agreement for the gala staff. I don't want any of the help leaking photos of my dress before the big reveal." She paused, her eyes landing on the tablet in Julian's hand. "What's that?" "Security logs." "Just checking the perimeter, Miss Vance," Julian said smoothly, tilting the screen away. Sienna smirked, stepping into Elena's personal space. She smelled of expensive lilies and unearned victory. "Good, make sure it's tight. I wouldn't want any accidents ruining my night." She leaned in closer to Elena, her voice a venomous whisper. 2 days, Elena. After the gala, Dad is announcing my appointment as co-CEO. You'll be lucky if he keeps you on as a receptionist. Elena met her sister's gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm sure the night will be unforgettable for everyone involved, Sienna." As Sienna swept out of the room, her heels clicking a rhythmic, arrogant beat against the marble, Elena turned back to the map. The red dot was steady. The trap was set. The countdown to the Vance family's public collapse had begun, and the woman who thought she had won was currently wearing the very thing that would destroy her. The following afternoon, the air in Julian Thorne's office felt thick with the scent of aged leather and high-grade espresso. Elena Vance sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the mahogany desk as Julian slid a sleek silver flash drive across the polished surface. The metal felt ice-cold against her palm, a physical weight that matched the gravity of what it contained. "It's all there," Julian said, his voice dropping to a cautious murmur. He adjusted his glasses, his expression uncharacteristically grim. "The security logs were just the tip of the iceberg, Elena. When I dug into the audit shadow, the secondary ledger Sienna's been using for the gala expenses, I found something much worse than simple overspending." She closed her fingers around the drive, feeling the sharp edges dig into her skin. "How much worse?" "Embezzlement," he replied. "She's been siphoning funds from the Vance Charitable Trust for months, masking the transfers as consulting fees for vendors that don't exist. She isn't just trying to buy her way into the co-CEO position. She's stealing the family's legacy to fund her personal debts." Elena felt a hollow ache in her chest, not for the money, but for the sheer audacity of her sister's betrayal. She thought of Arthur, their father, who looked at Sienna with such blind pride. "Does Marcus know?" "Marcus is the one signing the consulting checks," Julian confirmed. "Your sister hasn't just been sloppy, she's been predatory. If this goes public before you have total control of the board, it won't just destroy Sienna. It will liquidate the entire company." "Then we make sure it happens on my terms," she said, her voice like tempered steel. She stood up, smoothing the front of her modest charcoal blazer. It was a far cry from the $5,000 silk dresses Sienna wore like armor, but today, Elena felt more powerful than she ever had in designer labels. Tomorrow night is the gala. My father intends to announce her promotion in front of every major investor in the city. And what do you intend to do? She met his gaze, a flicker of cold fire in her eyes. I intend to give him the truth he's been refusing to see. 2 hours later, Elena arrived at the Vance corporate headquarters. The lobby was a cathedral of glass and ego, dominated by a massive digital countdown for the Vance Excellence Gala. As she stepped out of the elevator on the executive floor, the rhythmic screech of metal against marble set her teeth on edge. She stopped short. Her office, the modest space she had occupied for 5 years, was being gutted. 2 movers were hauling her desk toward the freight elevator, while her personal files were piled haphazardly in open cardboard boxes on the floor. Sienna Vance stood in the center of the chaos, draped in a cream-colored cashmere coat that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She was laughing, holding a glass of vintage champagne as she gestured for a decorator to hang a massive, gilded mirror where Elena's diplomas used to be. "What is this?" Elena asked, her voice dangerously calm. Sienna turned, her smile widening into something predatory. She smelled of expensive lilies and unearned victory. "Oh, Elena, I didn't think you'd be back today. I'm just expanding. Now that the co-CEO announcement is official for tomorrow, I need a suite that reflects my actual status. This little cubbyhole of yours is going to be my new walk-in wardrobe for my evening changes. You're turning my office into a closet." "It's the only thing it's suited for, darling," Sienna sneered, stepping closer until she was inches from Elena's face. She reached out, flicking a piece of lint off Elena's shoulder with a look of pure disgust. "You've always been a glorified assistant. It's time the floor plan reflected that. I've had your things moved to the basement archives. You can audit the dusty boxes down there. It's more your speed." Arthur Vance stepped out of the corner office, his brow furrowed as he looked at the mess. "Sienna, is this necessary right now? We have the investors arriving in 24 hours. "It's about branding, Dad," Sienna said, her voice instantly shifting into a sweet, persuasive lilt. She tucked her arm through his, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We can't have the new face of the company working next to. Well, it's about the image of success. Don't you want me to look the part?" Arthur sighed, patting her hand. He didn't even look at Elena. "I suppose you're right. First impressions are everything." He finally glanced toward his eldest daughter, his eyes distant. "Elena, don't make a scene. It's Sienna's big moment. Just go downstairs and stay out of the way until the gala. We need everything to be perfect." Sienna smirked over her father's shoulder, a silent, triumphant taunt. She leaned down and picked up a framed photograph from one of the boxes on the floor, a picture of Elena and their mother. With a casual, practiced motion, she let it slip through her fingers. The glass shattered against the marble, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet hallway. "Oops," Sienna whispered, her eyes dancing with malice. "So clumsy of me. But then again, old things are so fragile, aren't they?" Elena looked down at the broken glass, then up at her sister. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she felt a strange, chilling clarity. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the flash drive Julian had given her. "You're right, Sienna," Elena said, her voice soft enough that only her sister could hear. "First impressions are everything, and tomorrow night the world is going to see exactly who you are." Sienna let out a sharp, mocking laugh, turning back to her father. "See, she's fine. She knows her place." As Elena walked toward the stairs, leaving the wreckage of her office behind, she pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Julian. "The stage is set. Bring the original ledgers to the gala." "We aren't just doing an audit. We're doing an autopsy." She had 24 hours left. 24 hours until the Vance family's golden child realized that the pedestal she sat on was built on a foundation of stolen sand. Elena reached the stairwell, the door clicking shut behind her, plunging her into the quiet shadows of the building she had spent her life trying to save. The countdown had moved past the point of no return. Tomorrow, the sleeping lion wouldn't just wake up. She would tear the kingdom down. The morning of the annual Vance Foundation Gala began with the sharp, clinical scent of floor wax and lilies. It was a smell Elena Vance had associated with her father's triumphs for a decade. But today, it felt like the antiseptic preparation for a surgery. She stood in the foyer of the estate, watching a small army of caterers move crates of vintage crystal. The rhythmic clinking of glass was the only sound in the cavernous space until the front door swung open with a heavy thud. Sienna Vance swept into the room, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice a jagged blade of commands. She looked at her sister and didn't even pause her conversation, merely gesturing toward a stack of floral arrangements with a dismissive wave of her hand. When she finally hung up, she didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she adjusted the lapel of her designer blazer and smirked, her eyes raking over the other woman's simple knit dress. "I hope you found something decent to wear tomorrow night," she said, her tone dripping with the casual cruelty she had perfected since childhood. "The press will be in the front row. I won't have you looking like a charity case while I'm being named the new face of the legacy. It's bad for the brand." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cool weight of the silver locket around her neck, a gift from her grandmother that her sister had always called quaint. "The brand is built on more than just silk and lace, Sienna. You should be more concerned with what's underneath the surface." The younger woman let out a sharp, brittle laugh that echoed off the marble floors. "Always so dramatic. You've spent so much time in the books that you've forgotten how the real world works. People see the gold leaf, Elena. They don't care about the lead underneath. They do when the gold starts to flake," she replied softly. It was a warning, clear and cold, but it slid off her sister's arrogance like rain off a slate roof. She simply rolled her eyes and turned her attention back to a passing waiter, snapping at him for the way he held a tray of flutes. Arthur emerged from the study, his face flushed with the kind of pride that only comes from a curated lie. He walked straight to his youngest daughter, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. "The projections look incredible, Sienna. The board is already talking about the expansion. You've done what your sister couldn't. You've given this family a future." She watched them from the shadows of the hallway. The injustice of it burned, a slow-rolling heat in her chest, but she channeled it into the memory of the ledgers Julian had secured. Those documents weren't just numbers. They were a roadmap of every cent diverted and every contract signed in bad faith. Beatrice stood at the top of the grand staircase, her sharp eyes moving between her daughters. She didn't say a word, but as her gaze met Elena's, there was a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or a silent validation. She knew the storm was coming. She had always been the weather vane of the family, sensing the shift in the wind before the clouds even gathered. Later that afternoon, Julian met her in the quiet corner of a local park, far from the prying eyes of the estate. He handed her a slim, black flash drive. The metal felt ice-cold against her palm, a tactile promise of the chaos to come. "It's all there," he said, his voice low and steady. "The offshore transfers, the forged signatures on the audit reports. It's not just a scandal, Elena. It's a criminal case. Are you sure you want to do this in front of everyone?" "There's no coming back from a public execution." She closed her fingers over the drive. "She spent years making sure the world saw me as the failure. She used the public eye as a shield. It's only fair I use it as a sword." "The gala starts at 7, he reminded her. "I know," she said, looking toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, jagged shadows across the grass. "And by 8, the legacy will finally have the one thing it's been missing for years." "What's that?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "The truth." She spent the evening in her small apartment, the silence a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the estate. She touched the fabric of the gown she had chosen, a deep, midnight blue silk that felt like liquid shadow. It was a dress for a woman who was done hiding in the periphery. Tomorrow wasn't about a party or a promotion. It was the autopsy she had promised. She could almost hear the countdown ticking in the quiet room, each second bringing her closer to the moment the pedestal would finally crumble under the weight of its own secrets. The evening arrived with a chilling precision, the air outside the estate turning sharp and biting, as a fleet of black town cars began to choke the long, winding driveway. Elena Vance stood at the edge of the manicured lawn, her breath hitching slightly in the cold. The house, usually a tomb of quiet resentment, had been transformed into a glowing cathedral of glass and light. Every window blazed with the artificial warmth of 1,000 candles, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the stone facade like ghosts of the family's better years. She smoothed the fabric of her midnight blue gown, the silk cool and heavy against her skin. It was a tactile reminder of her own transformation, no longer the invisible daughter or the reliable shadow. Tonight, she was the storm. She could smell the cloying, sweet scent of 1,000 white lilies drifting from the open foyer, a fragrance so thick it felt like it was trying to mask the rot beneath the floorboards. "You're late," a voice snapped, cutting through the low hum of a distant cello quartet. Elena turned to see Sienna Vance standing in the doorway, a vision in shimmering gold sequins that caught the light with every aggressive breath she took. She looked like a trophy, polished and hollow. Her eyes swept over Elena with a familiar, practiced cruelty, lingering on the simple elegance of the blue silk. "I didn't think you'd actually show up," she continued, her voice dripping with a forced, high society lilt. "Though I suppose someone has to represent the charity side of the family. Just try to stay in the corners, Elena. I've invited the lead investors for the rebrand, and the last thing I need is you depressing them with your whatever it is you do." The first rage spike hit Elena like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She watched as her sister adjusted a diamond necklace that likely cost more than the annual budget of the wing she'd just shuttered. "I wouldn't dream of being anywhere else," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady contrast to the frantic energy radiating off her sister. "It's a big night for the legacy, after all." Sienna let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "The legacy is mine now. Father finally realized who has the stomach for this business. Now, go find Julian. He's been hovering near the bar like a lost dog. I suppose you two can commiserate over being irrelevant together." She turned on her heel without waiting for a response, the sound of her designer heels clicking against the marble like a metronome counting down to an explosion. Elena watched her go, her fingers grazing the small, hard shape of the encrypted drive tucked into her velvet clutch. The weight of it was a comfort, a secret power that made the insults feel like nothing more than static. The foyer was a sea of tailored tuxedos and vintage champagne. Elena moved through the crowd, noticing the way the vultures, as her grandmother called them, leaned in to whisper as she passed. They were sensing the shift in the air, the subtle electricity that precedes a lightning strike. "Elena!" She stopped as Arthur Vance stepped into her path. He looked older tonight, the lines around his eyes deepened by the stress of the impending announcement, yet his posture remained rigid with the same stubborn favoritism that had defined their lives. He didn't offer a smile, he offered a warning. "Your sister has worked very hard on this presentation," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The Vance name is on the line tonight. I expect you to be supportive. No difficult questions, no sidebarring with the board members. Do you understand?" The dismissal was so complete, so casual, that Elena felt the familiar heat of indignation rise in her throat. He wasn't asking for her support. He was demanding her silence. He saw her as a liability to be managed, while Sienna was the asset to be protected. "I understand perfectly, Father," she replied, her eyes meeting his without a hint of the old subservience. "I think everyone is going to get exactly what they deserve tonight." He narrowed his eyes, sensing a defiance he couldn't quite name, but a group of investors called his name, and he moved away, leaving her standing in the center of the room. A hand touched her elbow, firm and grounding. Julian Thorne appeared at her side, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know him, but Elena saw the glint of anticipation in his gaze. He smelled of cedar and the faint, metallic scent of a cold office. "The servers are synced," he whispered, leaning close as if sharing a romantic confidence. "The IT technician Sienna hired is. Let's just say he's more loyal to a fair paycheck than a Vance ego." The moment she hits start on that projector, the rebranding she thinks she's unveiling will be replaced. "And the board?" Elena asked, her pulse quickening. "They're all here, front row," Julian confirmed. "Even Beatrice is in her seat. She's been watching Sienna like a hawk all night. I think she knows the new direction is a house of cards." Elena looked across the room. Beatrice Vance sat in a high-backed velvet chair, her cane resting against her knee, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the predatory grace of an old lioness. When her gaze landed on Elena, she offered a single, almost imperceptible nod. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, a signal for the main event. The low chatter of the guests died down, replaced by the expectant rustle of silk and the soft clink of glasses being set aside. Sienna stepped onto the small, raised dais at the front of the room, the spotlight hitting her gold dress and turning her into a blinding, singular point of focus. She looked out at the audience, her face a mask of triumphant arrogance. She thought she was about to claim her throne. She thought she had successfully erased the past and buried the truth under a layer of expensive marketing. "Welcome, everyone," Sienna's voice boomed through the speakers, clear and commanding. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate the Vance legacy, we celebrate its rebirth. A new era of leadership, a new vision for our future." Elena felt Julian's hand tighten slightly on her arm. This was the wait-for-it moment, the breath before the plunge. She watched as Sienna reached for the remote on the podium, her thumb hovering over the button that would launch the presentation. Sienna glanced toward Elena in the back of the room, a final, mocking smirk curling her lips. She thought she was looking at a loser. She had no idea she was looking at the person who had already pulled the pin. "Let's see what the Vance future really looks like," Sienna announced, and pressed the button. The massive screen behind her flickered to life, but the sleek, corporate logo didn't appear. Instead, a grainy, high-definition video of a private office began to play, and the first few words of audio hissed through the ballroom speakers, freezing the breath in every lungs in the room. Elena stood perfectly still, her heart a drumbeat of cold, hard justice. The countdown was over. The autopsy had begun. The voice that hissed through the ballroom speakers was unmistakable, dripping with a casual cruelty that made the fine hairs on the back of Elena's neck stand up. It was Sienna, but not the polished, grieving daughter the socialites had seen all evening. This version of her sister was raw, greedy, and devastatingly honest. On the massive screen, the grainy footage showed a private office, the date stamp in the corner marking it as only 3 nights ago. "The old man is a fool, Marcus," the recorded version of Sienna Vance laughed, her image leaning back in Arthur's mahogany desk chair. She was holding a fountain pen, the one their father had received for his 50th anniversary, and spinning it like a toy. "He actually thinks I'm saving the company. He's so blinded by the idea of his loyal daughter that he didn't even look at the signature line. One more transfer, and the Vance legacy belongs to me. Elena can have the scraps. She's always been better at playing the martyr anyway." A collective, jagged gasp rippled through the ballroom, the sound of 300 hearts skipping a beat in unison. The smell of expensive lilies, once fragrant and celebratory, suddenly felt cloying, like the scent of a funeral parlor. Sienna froze at the podium, the remote control slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the hardwood floor with a sharp, hollow crack. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she lunged for the laptop. But the video continued, merciless and high definition. The footage shifted, showing her opening a hidden wall safe, a safe only Arthur and the board members were supposed to know existed. She was seen stuffing bundles of documents into a designer briefcase, her face twisted in a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. "He's becoming senile," the recording continued. "It's practically a mercy to take it from him before he loses it all to Elena's charity projects." Sienna's face didn't just pale. It seemed to physically dissolve under the harsh, unforgiving glow of the projector. The confident, porcelain mask she'd worn all evening shattered, revealing a frantic, jagged desperation that turned her features into a grotesque caricature of her former self. Her jaw hung slack, her mouth working soundlessly like a fish gasping for air, while a sickly, mottled gray hue crept from her throat to her hairline. Her eyes, once sharp with calculated malice, widened until the whites showed all the way around, darting toward the exits with the frantic rhythm of a cornered rat. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke out across her forehead, matting her perfect blonde curls against her skin as her shoulders slumped, the weight of her own recorded words finally crushing the spine of her arrogance. Arthur Vance looked as if he'd aged a decade in a single breath. He stood at the head table, his hand gripping his champagne flute so violently that the delicate crystal stems snapped, sending shards and sparkling wine cascading over the white linen. He didn't even notice the blood on his palm. Beside him, Beatrice Vance remained perfectly still, her spine a rod of iron. She didn't look at the screen. She looked directly at Sienna, her gaze fixed with the clinical detachment of a judge delivering a final sentence. Julian Thorne stepped out from the shadows near the stage, his expression a mask of professional steel. He didn't say a word, but he held up a leather portfolio, the silver seal of the Vance legal department catching the light. Across the room, Marcus shifted on his feet, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. The board members, who only minutes ago had been nodding in agreement with Sienna's vision, were now physically leaning away from her, as if her disgrace were a contagious disease. Elena walked slowly toward the podium, the sound of her heels on the marble floor the only rhythm in the suffocating silence. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply stood in the light of the projector, her shadow falling directly across her sister's trembling form. "You told me I didn't belong in this world, Sienna," she said, her voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration that carried to every corner of the room. "You told everyone I was a ghost, but ghosts have a way of bringing the truth back from the dead." She reached out and picked up the fallen remote. With a single click, she froze the image on the screen, a perfect, clear shot of Sienna's hand forging Arthur's signature. "The board is waiting in the library," Elena continued, her eyes as cold as the winter sea. "And the police are waiting at the front gates. I think it's time you showed yourself out." Without waiting for a response, Elena turned her back on the wreckage of her sister's life. She walked toward the grand mahogany doors, her head held high, leaving the room to the rising storm of whispers and the sight of Sienna Vance collapsing into the ruins of her own making. The autopsy was over. The cause of death was greed. Sienna's scream ripped through the vaulted marble foyer, a jagged, ugly sound that stripped away the last of her carefully curated poise. She lunged after her sister, her fingers clawing at the air as if she could physically pull the truth back into the shadows. The sound of her frantic, uneven heels clicked desperately against the polished stone, a sharp contrast to the steady, rhythmic retreat of the woman she had spent a lifetime trying to bury. "You planted that!" She shrieked, her voice cracking into a high-pitched register that made the gathered board members wince. "Arthur, don't listen to her. It's a deep fake, a setup. She's always been jealous of me. She's trying to steal my life." Arthur Vance stood at the entrance of the library, his face a mask of crumbling disbelief. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago, the lines around his eyes deepening into canyons of grief. Beside him, Beatrice watched the unfolding chaos with a chilling, silent satisfaction. She didn't move to help her younger daughter. She simply adjusted her pearls, her sharp eyes tracking the path of the digital evidence that was currently being projected onto the monitors in the adjacent room. The board members, men and women who had toasted Sienna's visionary leadership only an hour ago, now stood in a tight, judgmental semicircle. They didn't look at her with pity. They looked at her like a contagion. Mr. Sterling, the board chair, stepped back as she stumbled past, his lip curling in a gesture of profound distaste. The smell of expensive floor wax and stale champagne hung heavy in the air, suddenly feeling suffocating. Julian Thorne stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway, his leather briefcase clicking open with the finality of a guillotine blade. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his presence brought a sudden, heavy silence to the foyer. "The forensic digital trail is absolute, Sienna," he said, his voice a calm, professional blade. He handed a thick sheaf of documents to Arthur, but his eyes remained fixed on the woman spiraling in the center of the room. Every keystroke, every unauthorized transfer from the trust, and the metadata on the forged signature. It's all here, verified by 3 independent firms. There is no setup. There is only the paper trail you were too arrogant to think anyone would follow. Sienna's face underwent a horrific transformation. The porcelain mask of the Vance heiress didn't just crack, it shattered. The blood drained from her skin with such violent speed that she turned the color of wet ash. Her eyes, once bright with predatory arrogance, became hollow pits of terror, darting toward every exit only to find them blocked by the people she had spent years looking down upon. Her jaw slackened, her mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O, as her breathing became a series of sharp, panicked wheezes that whistled in the sudden, suffocating silence of the hall. Her posture, usually so rigid and commanding, collapsed inward until she looked small, fragile, and utterly broken amidst the opulence she had sold her soul to keep. "Wait," she gasped, her hand trembling as she reached for Arthur's sleeve. Her perfect manicure, a deep blood red, looked like a stain against his dark suit. "Dad, please, I did it for the family. I did it for you. You wanted the company to stay strong, and I was the only one who could do it." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to feel her touch. He looked down at the documents in his hand, then at the daughter he had once favored above all others. The silence stretched, long and agonizing, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of heavy boots approaching the front entrance. "I don't have a daughter named Sienna," Arthur whispered, the words sounding like they cost him his soul. He pulled his arm away with a slow, deliberate motion that sent her stumbling back. "I only have a thief in my house, a thief who stole from her own blood while her sister was mourning." The heavy mahogany front doors swung open. 2 officers entered, the scent of rain and damp pavement clinging to their dark coats. Marcus, the family's head of security, stepped aside to let them through, his expression as cold as the marble beneath his feet. He had seen enough of Sienna's management style to know exactly which side of history he wanted to be on. "Sienna Vance?" the lead officer asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She simply watched as the handcuffs were pulled from the officer's belt. The metallic clink of the steel was the loudest sound in the room. Elena stopped at the threshold of the grand exit. She didn't turn around to gloat. She didn't need to see the handcuffs click shut, though the sound vibrated through the very marrow of her bones. She felt the weight of years of gaslighting and forced silence finally lifting, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. "You always said I didn't belong in this world, Sienna," Elena said, her voice steady and resonant, carrying to every corner of the foyer. She finally looked back, her gaze meeting the hollow, haunted eyes of the woman who had tried to erase her. "You were right. I don't belong in a world built on lies and stolen signatures. But you're going exactly where you belong." Without waiting for the inevitable sobbing or the hollow pleas for mercy that were sure to follow, Elena stepped out into the cool night air. Behind her, the doors of the Vance estate began to close, shutting out the storm of whispers and the sight of a legacy collapsing into the dirt. She walked toward the waiting car, her head held high, leaving the ruins of her sisters making to the cold light of justice. The reckoning had arrived, and for the first time in a decade, Elena breathed air that didn't taste like someone else's secrets. 6 months had passed since the dust of the Vance legal battle finally settled, leaving a silence in its wake that was both deafening and liberating. Elena Vance stood in the center of her new architectural firm, the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite offering a panoramic view of the city she had finally reclaimed. The air here didn't smell of mahogany and old secrets. It smelled of fresh white lilies and the crisp, clean scent of new blueprints. She smoothed the front of her charcoal gray silk suit, the fabric cool against her skin. There were no wine stains here, no jagged memories of being told she didn't belong. She belonged exactly where her talent had placed her. A soft knock at the doorframe made her turn. Julian Thorne stood there, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm and a genuine smile softening his usually stern features. He looked at the Vance and Associates logo etched into the glass with a nod of approval. "The final liquidation of the estate is complete," Julian said, his voice echoing slightly in the airy office. He stepped inside, the rhythmic tap of his polished shoes a steady, grounding sound. After the creditors were satisfied and the forensic accountants finished with the offshore accounts Sienna tried to hide, there wasn't much left of the original Vance holdings. Just enough to keep Arthur in that assisted living facility in the valley. Elena turned back to the window. She thought of Arthur Vance, once a man who commanded boardrooms with a flick of his wrist, now spending his afternoons in a sunroom, confused as to why his favorite daughter never visited. He had chosen the wrong legacy to protect, and the cost had been everything. "And Sienna?" Elena asked, her voice calm, devoid of the jagged edges of her former rage. "She's still at the boutique on 5th, Julian replied, pulling a document from his folder. "The one where she used to have a $10,000 a month line of credit. Life has a funny way of coming full circle." Later that afternoon, Elena found herself standing outside that very boutique. She didn't go in for spite. She went in because she needed a specific silk scarf for Beatrice Vance's 75th birthday gala. Beatrice had been the only one to stand in the courtroom and speak the truth, and Elena owed her the world. The bell chimed as she stepped into the sanctuary of high-end leather and cloying, expensive perfume. A sales associate was kneeling on the floor, frantically reorganizing a display of designer handbags that a customer had left in disarray. The woman's hair was frizzy, escaping a haphazard bun, and her cheap polyester uniform vest was pilling at the seams. "I'll be with you in a moment," the worker snapped, her voice high and strained with a familiar, entitled irritation. Elena waited. When the worker finally stood and turned, the blood drained from her face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. Sienna Vance froze. Her eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now rimmed with the red-rimmed exhaustion of someone who worked double shifts and lived on caffeine. She looked at Elena's tailored suit, the subtle sparkle of the diamond studs in her ears, and the sheer, unshakable confidence in her sister's posture. Sienna's hand went instinctively to her chest, trying to cover the plastic name tag pinned to her vest. Her mouth opened, then closed, her throat working as she struggled to find a shard of her old arrogance. But there was nothing left. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of every insult Sienna had ever hurled, every lie she had ever signed. "I need the midnight blue silk wrap from the window display," Elena said. Her tone wasn't mocking, it was worse. It was professional. She spoke to Sienna with the polite, distant courtesy one offered a stranger. Sienna's fingers trembled as she reached for the display. She had to ring up the sale, her manicured nails now chipped and blunt as they tapped the touchscreen. When the total appeared, a price that would have been pocket change to them a year ago, but was now likely 2 weeks of Sienna's rent, Sienna flinched. "Will that be all, Ms. Vance?" Sienna whispered, the name tasting like poison in her mouth. "Yes," Elena replied, sliding her black card across the counter. As Elena walked toward the exit, she caught her reflection in the glass door. She looked successful, powerful, and entirely alone. She had won. The signatures were hers, the wealth was hers, and the justice was absolute. But as she stepped out into the biting autumn wind, she felt the phantom weight of the family she had lost to get here. She climbed into the back of her car, the leather seats smelling of luxury, and looked at the cracked screen of her personal phone. A photo from 15 years ago sat in her gallery, 3 people laughing at a summer barbecue, before greed had rotted the roots of their home. Elena deleted the photo, her thumb steady, and told the driver to head toward the gala. The cost of the truth had been her family, but for the first time in her life, she was breathing air that belonged entirely to her.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.